admit everybody.
All right, so it's 4. Yeah, welcome everybody to this week's reset. We are very happy to have Paula Onuchic, who's going to present how do groups speak and how are they understood. We joined work with Avoyan, who's also here and kindly agreed to answer questions in the chat. So if you have smaller clarification questions, feel free to post them in the chat. Otherwise, you're also free to unmute yourselves and ask questions. We also have 2 panelists. We have Agata, Farina, and Eduardo Perez-Richet, who are also going to ask questions. Thanks very much for being here, everyone. And before we start, let me advertise next week's talk. Next week, we have Andrew Kaplan, who is going to talk about human and machine learning, a cognitive economic approach. So come back for that. All right, that's all. And over to Paula.
Good. Okay, so thank you very much, Julia, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to speak here. And also, of course, thank you to Eduardo and Agata, who agreed to be panelists here. I was also happy to see a bunch of familiar names when there was a wave of people coming in. And so nice to see you all. Okay, so I already told Julia, and so I will say it again. Even though this is seminars in economic theory, this paper is mainly an experimental paper. Okay, it does start with a theoretical component, which is like what leads into the experiment. But I think most of the scope of what I'm doing here today is going to be experimental. Okay, so this paper starts from the observation that there's many circumstances in which communication is done by organizations rather than by individual actors. So let me give you a few examples. So if you think about political parties, they're not made up of a bunch of politicians who just go around saying whatever they want, even though some politicians might say whatever they want sometimes. But usually they meet and they somehow chat and they collectively agree on what stances these members of the party should publicly hold regarding politically relevant issues. Also, if you want to think about, say, a magazine or a newspaper, a lot of editorial decisions are usually made by editorial boards rather than by just a single editor, okay? And these people might have different preferences and different views on what should or should not be published in the magazines or newspapers' next issue. Also, if you want to think about like startups, most startups are founded by teams of startup founders, of entrepreneurs, and these people usually jointly decide when and how to pitch startup ideas to potential investors. Okay, so in all these circumstances that I mentioned, we have groups of people who perhaps have different views on how these groups should be communicating with outsiders, and they come to a collective choice on how this group should communicate. So if we look at Sayre and March 63, this is one of the seminal papers to organizational economics. So I wanted to quote them here. So they say people have goals, collectivities of people do not, okay? I think what they were trying to get at here is that if we're trying to understand how organizations work or how organizations behave, it's not enough to write a model for an individual and assume that they have like preferences, okay? And to see how this individual would behave in this model and to interpret that individual as being the organization. Instead, we have to actually model the collective of people who belongs to this organization, who have perhaps different preferences and who go through some maybe contentious process that they use to agree on how this organization should behave, okay? So in this paper, we really take Sayre and March's view, and we try to think about how organizations communicate, how groups communicate, where we think of groups as being this collective of individuals who reach decisions via perhaps an uneven aggregation of their often conflicting goals. Okay, So I told you that the paper is going to have like a theoretical and an experimental component. So let me first introduce you a bit about what I'm going to say in terms of the theory. So the theory that I'm going to introduce here is going to be a very simple version of a model that me and another co-author, Joel, have introduced in a previous paper. Okay, so this is a model of group communication. And specifically, it's a model in which a group communicates through a very specific communication protocol, which is the disclosure protocol. And when I say disclosure here, you should be thinking about disclosure of hard evidence, as in like Grossman and Milgram. But instead of looking at like an individual making disclosure choices, we're going to be thinking about a group who makes disclosure choices. So a group is made of individuals who have perhaps conflicting preferences regarding disclosure or non-disclosure of some evidence that realizes. And this group makes a collective disclosure decision that aggregates all these different interests through some predetermined deliberation procedure, okay? I want to think about this deliberation procedure as being something that describes what is the power balance in this group, okay? So how we aggregate everyone's opinions and who has power to enforce their decision as being the group's decision, yeah? Okay, so in terms of theory, I'm going to try to show you briefly two results today, which are also part in that paper. So these results are first that when we look at a model of disclosure in which a group is making disclosure decisions, the usual unraveling results that we have for individual disclosure don't necessarily apply. And we might have equilibria in which we don't have full disclosure, okay? And apart from that result, I'm also going to try to show you another result that establishes a relationship between the group's deliberation procedure and the equilibrium interpretation of when this group does not disclose, okay? So here in this model, no disclosure is the only message that the group might send that still has to be interpreted by the observer, okay? So this second result that I'm going to talk to you about, this relationship between the deliberation procedure and the interpretation of no disclosure, I want you to think about this as being, as saying that the power balance in the group, which is described by this deliberation procedure, determines how equilibrium messages are interpreted, okay? Or in other words, the power balance in the group determines how groups are understood, okay? So that's where that part of the title comes from. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about this in the theory, and then this second result mainly, is going to be the basis for our experimental exploration. So in terms of experiments, we're going to adapt this group disclosure environment to an experimental setting. And this theoretical prediction is going to serve as the basis for our main hypothesis, okay? Our main experimental results that I'm going to show you today are first that the main theoretical predictions that are going to be confirmed in the experiment. And we see that as establishing experimentally that the balance of power between individuals of an organization plays a dual role in group communication. So first, it determines how the group speaks, so how these opinions get aggregated, and also, as I was mentioning before, how they are understood. The second thing in terms of experiment that I'm going to try to show you today is that there's also some parts of like what we see in the lab that do not really match up with the theory. Specifically, what doesn't match up is how individuals in the group make recommendations about how the group should communicate, okay? So these individual strategies don't, in the lab, what we see doesn't really match up with what the theory predicts. And then we're going to try to argue that some of these discrepancies that we see in the lab between lab and theory can partly be attributed to altruistic social preference, okay? This is what I'm trying to do today. Just a brief comment in terms of related literature. There's a very long literature in terms of like theory, okay, that I'm just skipping here for today. But in terms of experiments, our paper is mainly related to two types of experiments. First, to experiments that are on communication, and this is a huge literature, and also to experiments that are experiments played by groups, okay? So these are two very big literatures. The intersection of them is quite small, and I think that's what we're contributing to, okay? And I think I wanted to say that in most of the papers that we think about in terms of experiments played by groups, these are settings in which groups are sets of people who all have the same preferences, and perhaps they have different different information, and they're just trying to sort of aggregate information mainly, okay? So what we do here today is very different from that, in that we're just really interested in the conflicts of preferences in the people in a group. And in terms of communication experiments, to which both of our panelists here have contributed before, so our main contributions that we're thinking about a group communication. Of course, this is mostly related to multi-sender communication, but it still differs from that in the sense that we don't have multiple senders who are separately communicating with a receiver, but rather we have a group of senders who are like cohesively and collectively trying to communicate with this audience. Okay, this is it for my intro. I'll tell you a model unless you have some questions.
I do have a small
Yes.
question. In the deliberation procedure you were mentioning, there is no communication between the two senders. Like the group of senders is just like a decision that comes according to a rule. Like, how do you think about that? Because in like applications, sometimes the group communicates and decides what the outcome of the disclosure.
Absolutely. So I think there's many different answers to this. I think in terms of the theory here, when we're writing our theory, anything that matters for someone's decision making is something that they're already going to know without talking to this other person. So, like in a sense, like in the model, there's no like nothing to be gained for these people from talking to each other. Okay, so I think that's theoretically. In terms of like the experiment, of course, like maybe just there's more than just like information sharing that goes on when people are communicating or when they're chatting. And in the experiments that we do today, we're not going to allow these people to talk to each other, although of course this happens in real life. One of the things that Ala and I are really like excited to do going forward, also in terms of experiments, is to try to look into other treatments in which people can also have like some informal chatter, okay, on top of the actual like formal decision rule. So I don't have anything to say about that right now, and that's going to be shut down for the rest of the talk today. But certainly, it is something that is important, and we're looking to investigate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let me tell you a model. So here's the model. As I said, there's going to be a simple version of the group disclosure model that we have in this previous paper. Okay, so here a group is going to be made of two group members, person A and person B, okay? And a group is going to draw an outcome, omega. This outcome is going to have a value for person A, omega A, and a value for person B, omega B, okay? This value to each of the group members is going to be something that is going to be drawn from a uniform between 0 and 1. And it's also independently drawn across the two individuals. Yeah. Okay. After this outcome realizes, the group is going to decide whether or not they want to disclose it to a third-party observer. Okay. I told you many times already that the main innovation in like the model is that we have this group decides part, okay? So I'll tell you about how the group makes this decision in a second, but first let me tell you what the payoffs are once these decisions are made. So if the group chooses to disclose this outcome, then the observer is going to see what the outcome is, and they're going to perfectly understand it, and each person's payoff is going to be exactly equal to the value of the outcome given by the omega A and omega B. Okay, so person I's value is going to be omega I. Okay, if instead the group chooses not to disclose the outcome, then the observer is not going to see it, but they're going to notice the absence of disclosure, and they're going to try to infer what is the possible outcome value, omega A and omega B, that might have led the group to choose not to disclose, okay? So in particular, for person I, the observer is going to say, hey, I see that the group chose not to disclose. What are all the possible circumstances that might have led to this decision? And amongst those situations, what is the expected value of omega I? That's going to be the omega I of no disclosure, and that posterior is going to be the payoff to person I of no disclosure. Yeah. Of course, that's going to be an equilibrium object here. Okay, before I tell you how the group decides, also let me stop here a little bit for an interpretation. So I think this is a very simple communication procedure, right? So they're only choosing whether to disclose or not disclose. I think this can fit some applications, and I'll tell you like maybe a couple interpretations here. But also I wanted to remark that one of the things that we wanted, especially in terms of the experiment, is to try to think about the communication protocol that's the simplest communication protocol that we can think of, and adds to that communication protocol this idea that groups make decisions. So we want to, like, what we're hoping is that some of the things that we're learning here about group communication also apply to other communication protocols that you might think of, maybe like more complicated evidence structures, things like this. But we're starting here from an environment in which is the simplest possible communication environment that we can think of, okay? But let me give you a possible interpretation. So let me describe, for example, this career concerns in a heterogeneous team. So suppose, for example, that Agata and I work at Google, okay? And Agata is an engineer and I'm a marketer. And suppose that we've been assigned to a project, and then we produce like a prototype, okay? And we have this meeting with our manager that was pre-scheduled. And then we're going to go to this meeting with our manager, and the manager is going to say, hey, Paula, hey, Agata, can I see your prototype? Okay, this prototype is this outcome, of course. And suppose that the prototype that we produced, in terms of like its technical advances, it's fantastic, okay? But actually, it's sort of badly packaged. It's like doesn't have a good. Its packaging is sort of bad. So even though this is just one prototype that we produced, if the manager sees it, they're going to think, oh, Agata is fantastic because the engineering contribution here is very good. So the value to Agata of like having the manager see this would be very high. However, even though it's the same outcome, they would think, oh, Paula, the marketer, did a bad job packaging this, and therefore the value to Paula is not actually very high. So what I want to convey here is that it's a situation in which even though we are part of the group, and even though there's only one piece of evidence that we might choose to disclose or not to disclose to our manager, we might have different values from that, right? Okay, so finally, let me tell you how this group makes the disclosure decisions. So each group member is going to see only their own component of this outcome vector, and they're going to make a disclosure recommendation. They're either going to suggest that we should disclose the outcome, or they're going to suggest that we should not disclose the outcome. Okay. I always get this question, so let me anticipate it. That here, of course, I'm saying to you that each person is only going to see their own outcome value. But in terms of the theory, it wouldn't really matter if they see only their own outcome value or also their partner's outcome value, because all that matters for each person's value in terms of like making this decision is their own components. So they're not interested in the information that the other person has, okay? However, in terms of the experiment, I think that would make a difference. And in the experiment, we made the choice to show people only the value of their own realization, okay? So that's why I'm pitching the model in this way here today. Okay, so once these people make these recommendations, these recommendations are going to get aggregated through some aggregation procedure, which is what I was calling before the deliberation procedure, okay? So this deliberation procedure is, let's say, a social choice function, okay? Which is just basically saying that we aggregate the two recommendations into a decision, okay, of whether we disclose or don't disclose. So little d of omega here is the probability that we disclose the piece of information omega, which is given by the big D of the two recommendations, yeah? So this big D is the deliberation procedure. And we make two assumptions about what this deliberation procedure has to satisfy. So first, we assume that it satisfies, it agrees with consensual group decisions. So if everyone in the group wants to disclose, then the group discloses. If everyone in the group does not want to disclose, then they do not disclose. And also it satisfies monotonicity in the sense that if a larger set of the group members wants to disclose, then we should disclose with a higher probability, okay? So these assumptions are what we need for the results that I'm going to tell you later today. But in terms of the experiment, so most of what I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to be focusing only on 3 possible deliberation procedures. So let me introduce those to you. Okay. So first, we're going to consider a procedure that we call the consensus procedure, according to which, of course, if both of us recommend disclosure, we disclose. If neither of us recommends disclosure, we do not. But also, if only one of us recommends to disclose, then we do not disclose. Okay, so this is saying that in order to disclose, this must be a consensus decision between the two people in this group. Yeah, otherwise, we're not going to disclose. Sort of the opposite is what we call the unilateral procedure, that says that both of the group members have the unilateral power to enforce disclosure of the outcome. Okay, so if either of us recommends disclosure, then the outcome gets disclosed, the evidence gets disclosed for sure. Finally, there's another procedure which we call the leader procedure, according to which we almost always follow whatever person A says. Okay, so person A here is the leader. So if person A says we should disclose, then we do with almost certainly. And if person A says we don't want to disclose, then we almost certainly do not disclose. Yeah. So let me just tell equilibrium is here.
Sorry, can you tell us a bit in advance what's the role of the epsilon probability here?
Yes.
Do you have an interpretation for it, or is it just?
So I don't have a particular interpretation for this. The only reason why we have the epsilon was in terms of the experiment. We wanted to make sure that the person who is not the leader still has some incentive to like sort of truthfully report their opinion. You know, so they know that something is at stake still. It's not they're going to be completely ignored. But that's the main.
Can I think of it as maybe an unlikely opportunity to be able to leak the information? It would be.
Yes, that's one way that you could think about this. For example, sometimes I think about these deliberation procedures as sort of like describing what is the reach that each of the people in the group have. You know, like, so for example, maybe Agata is the leader, okay? And so maybe that just means that like Agata is super well connected. So she knows a lot of people in the world, and like if she has the evidence, she can disclose it to a lot of people, yeah? Versus me, Paula, I'm the non-leader. Maybe that just means that I don't know anyone. So like, even if I leak it to everyone that I want to leak it to, that's like not going to make any difference. Like basically, I don't know anyone. I only know epsilon of the population. So that's one possible interpretation. Is just like some like what is our leakage potential?
If I may to ask.
Yes.
So kind of the first question. Disclose or not disclose is an integer recommendation, right? So it can be like 1/2 reflecting the level of confidence. And the second question, your model has only 2 members in the group, right? So something like majority doesn't work here. That's
right. So yes, first, yes. So either I recommend disclose or I recommend no disclose. So, but here, people are either strictly going to want to disclose or strictly not want to disclose. So even if they had the options to say I want to disclose 50% or something, they would never do this. They would always make the extreme recommendations. Okay, so I think that part is without loss. On the other hand, the other thing you asked was about the size of the group, right, and what a majority rule would be or something like this. So in this in the previous paper, this one that I was referring to, one of the generalizations that we allow for, so it generalizes the setup that I told you about in many different ways. So for example, we allow for different distributions, but also we have more people. And the results that I'm going to show you today, I'm going to comment on how they generalize to a setup with more people and so on. But the reason why I'm giving you just this simplest environment today is mainly because that's what we're going to adapt to the experimental setting. But point taken, and I'll comment later on what I think would be conclusions that I would like to also have in bigger groups. Okay. So let me just tell you what an equilibrium is going to be here. Basically, it's going to be a weak PBE, but with a little difference. So everyone here in this model understands what the deliberation procedure in the group is. Okay, so the people in the group understand it, and the observer understands it. So these individuals are going to make these individual recommendations of whether they want to disclose or not. And the observer is going to form these no disclosure posteriors. Okay, so these are the equilibrium objects. So these are going to be an equilibrium if the following holds. So first, I'm going to ask that the group members make disclosure recommendations as if they're pivotal. So if I strictly prefer to disclose the payoff of disclosure over not disclosure, then it has to be that I recommend disclosure for sure. If I strictly prefer to not disclose over to disclose, then it has to be that I recommend no disclosure for sure, okay? For the deliberation procedures that I told you about before, this requirement of the making recommendations as if they're pivotal is equivalent to asking that people don't use weakly dominated strategies. So if you want to think about it that way, then you can think about it that way. Also, once the people make these recommendations, they have to be aggregated into the group's decision through the deliberation procedure, okay, that is given. And the no disclosure posteriors have to be base consistent. So if no disclosure happens on path, then the belief of no disclosure has to be consistent with the group's disclosure strategy, okay? If no disclosure does not happen on path, then I'm not making any requirements on what these beliefs of no disclosure have to satisfy, okay? Okay, result. So here, this theorem is saying...
Sorry, Paula, can you
Yes.
just, on the last thing about on and off equilibrium path, how could you be off equilibrium path? Because here, if, I don't know, omega, you got uniforms and so on, right? So it would always be possible that the event where nobody wants to disclose occurs, right? Or I'm definitely missing something, obviously, right?
No, maybe everyone always recommends disclosure, and then disclosure happens for sure.
But types are between 0 and 1, right?
Yes.
With some distribution. So
But what if the belief?
Okay, go on.
It could be that the belief of no disclosure is exactly 0, in which case I'm willing to recommend disclosure for every realization. Actually, that's what I'm going to say next once I introduce my theorem. So let me just argue. This is exactly what I was going to say now. So, okay. So this is what the theorem is saying. So given a deliberation procedure D, these are some statements about the equilibrium set. So first, a full disclosure equilibrium exists, okay, regardless of what the deliberation procedure is. So to see this, suppose that the observer thinks that upon seeing no disclosure, then both person A and person B for sure got their worst possible realization. So they're going to give person A and person B the value of 0, okay? That means that both person A and person B are always willing to recommend the disclosure of the outcome. And because both of them always recommend the disclosure of the outcome, then disclosure for sure gets enforced. And so every outcome realization gets disclosed, yeah? And so no disclosure only happens off path. And I'm not making any requirements on what these off paths beliefs have to satisfy. And therefore the 0, 0 that I started with is just fine, okay? So that's how I would support a full disclosure equilibrium. Okay, perhaps more interestingly, what we show is that there might be another equilibrium, okay, in which there isn't full disclosure, okay? And this exists if at least one of the two group members does not have the power to unilaterally enforce the disclosure of the outcome. So for the deliberation procedures that I told you about, what this theorem is saying is that under the unilateral procedure, in which both of us can unilaterally enforce disclosure, there exists only a full disclosure equilibrium, okay? But for the other two procedures, the consensus procedure and the leader procedure, there exists another equilibrium in which does not have full disclosure, okay? Let me try to briefly argue proof intuition for this result here so that you understand the mechanism behind this, but I'll be brief. So to show this result, what I want to do is let's start by conjecturing that there is an equilibrium in which the observer believes that upon seeing no disclosure, neither person A nor person B necessarily drew their worst possible outcome. Okay, so both of these equilibrium beliefs are not 0. Okay, so given these conjectures, we can say what are the regions of no disclosure for person A and for person B, or what are the disclosure recommendations for person A and for person B. So person A is going to recommend no disclosure when they get a realization that is worse than the belief that we started with, and they're going to recommend disclosure otherwise. Person B is going to recommend no disclosure when they got a realization that is worse than what we started with, and they're going to recommend disclosure otherwise, okay? So in blue, there's the region that person B recommends no disclosure. Oh, it should be B here, not 2. And in red is where person A recommends no disclosure. Okay, so these are the recommendations that these people make. But now we have to see what is the deliberation procedure to see how these recommendations get aggregated into decisions for the group, okay? So suppose for starters, that the group uses the unilateral procedure so that both of these people have the power to enforce disclosure, okay? In this case, given these recommendations, the region of no disclosure is only going to be this rectangle here, this purple rectangle, right? Because here in blue is a situation in which person 1 is going to be enforcing disclosure, and in red is a situation in which person 2 is going to be enforcing disclosure. But now you can see that in this purple rectangle, every realization is worse for person A than the initial conjecture. And also every realization is worse for person B than the initial conjecture. So it means that these two initial conjectures cannot be base consistent, right? So what I'm sort of arguing here is sort of the usual unraveling argument, right? But I'm doing it in 2 dimensions. I'm saying that we're getting some unraveling in the A dimension and some unraveling in the B dimension. So this is saying that under the unilateral procedure, such an equilibrium cannot exist. And in particular, the unique equilibrium is going to be full disclosure. Now, suppose instead that the group uses the consensus procedure to make these decisions. In that case, this whole L-shaped region is going to be a region of no disclosure, given these recommendations, right? Because here, there's some really good realizations in blue. There's some really good realizations for person 1 that they would like to disclose, but person B is vetoing it. And in red, there's some really good realizations for person 2 that they would like to disclose, but person A is vetoing it. So now you can see that the expected value of omega A in this whole L-shaped region, it could be greater or equal than the initial conjecture. And the same thing for the expected value of omega B, right? So what the theorem is saying is that there exists a pair of such initial conjectures such that they are exactly justified by these individually rational disclosure recommendations, okay? And for the unilateral distribution that we chose here, there's going to be a unique such pair, okay, for all deliberation procedures in the class that I told you about, okay? Okay, so just to conclude, what happens here in the consensus procedure is that the unraveling logic breaks because the observer is not able to attribute blame for no disclosure across person A and person B. So if they see no disclosure, they say, something went wrong with this group, someone had a bad value, but they don't know whether they're skeptical about person A or about person B. So this inability to attribute the skepticism or the blame is what breaks the unraveling logic. Okay. So now trying to get towards our experimental set part, let me tell you, for the deliberation procedures that we're interested in, the 3 that I told you about, what do the equilibrium exactly look like? So for the unilateral procedure, as I said, the unique equilibrium is going to be full disclosure. And so that means that the belief of no disclosure is going to be equal to 0. Oh, I forgot to say one thing. So let me stop here. So even though for the consensus procedure and the leader procedure, a full disclosure equilibrium also exists, I'm not going to argue this to you today, but actually the equilibrium without full disclosure is going to be the sequential equilibrium, and also the equilibrium that survives a set of other possible refinements. So in a sense, we think of that as being the correct equilibrium, and that's the one that we're going to be thinking about when going to our experiment. Okay. So that in the unilateral procedure, these are the beliefs of no disclosure in the full disclosure equilibrium. And then in the consensus procedure, if we're looking at the equilibrium without full disclosure, the beliefs of no disclosure are this. So 0.38, okay, is the belief about person A and person B. And in the leader procedure, the observer is going to think that the leader has got the value of 0, and that the known leader, actually, they didn't learn any known leader's value. And so they believe that the known leader's value is 0.5 when they see no disclosure, yeah? So here I'm stating these beliefs of no disclosure. I'm going to rewrite them in another way. So because I want to be talking about skepticism as a measure of like what happened of these beliefs, okay? So I'm going to say that this sigma I here is going to be the measure of skepticism of the observer with respect to person I, okay? So this is just a rewriting of that equilibrium belief. So this is going to measure how much more skeptical the observer is about person I's outcome when they see no disclosure than they would be if they had no information at all, yeah? Okay, so I can restate this proposition that I had before, just instead of having this belief, these beliefs, I'm going to state the values of the skepticism. So under the unilateral procedure, they should be fully skeptical about both people. In the consensus procedure, they should be 24% skeptical about each of them. And in the leader treatment, they should be procedure, they should be fully skeptical about the leader and not skeptical at all about the no leader. Okay, so, okay, it's just looking at time. Okay, so so I think what we want to get at with this proposition is that there's a relationship between the balance of power, or like the deliberation procedure, and the skepticism of the observer when they see no disclosure, right? So we believe, and this is what we try to do in this other paper, which I already mentioned many times today, is that there's this relation. It does not hold only for deliberation procedures that we're looking at here, okay? It's a more general thing that also applies for groups that have more people and so on. And but here, this result, these three deliberation procedures, we're just using them to illustrate this more general principle that we have in mind, okay? So the more general principle that we have in mind is two things. One, that if someone becomes more powerful in the group, so let's say if I compare two different deliberation procedures, one in which A is relatively more powerful than in the other, then it should be that when person A is relatively more powerful, then the observer is also more skeptical about them when they see no disclosure. Okay, I'm not defining anything here, but would love to talk about it later. Also, there's another notion that we argue is that if the balance of power doesn't change, but the deliberation procedure changes in a way that disclosure becomes proportionally easier, then also these beliefs of no disclosure should be such that the observer becomes more skeptical about everyone in the group when they see no disclosure. So I think this more general principle is sort of what we want to test in the lab, and the way that we're testing this in the lab is through this particular simplified environment that we're looking at today. Okay, I'll tell you about the experiment. I know that usually people tell you exactly what they did in the lab, and then they tell you their hypothesis. I'm going to do the opposite, and maybe that's going to be the wrong thing to do, but let's go. So I just want to tell you our hypothesis already, because they really follow directly from this proposition that I just spoke about, okay? So so this restated proposition is the basis for our first set of experimental hypotheses. So one thing we could do is to try to test whether exactly these numbers arise in the lab, okay? But that's not what we do. And the main reason that we don't do that is because there's previous literature on disclosure in the lab, on individual disclosure, that finds that even though theory predicts full unraveling or full disclosure and full skepticism, that's not what we see in the lab. We see less than full disclosure, okay? So we weren't very hopeful that we were going to observe the exact numbers that we predict in the lab based on that. So what we decided to test instead is a hypothesis regarding the ordering of these skepticism across the different deliberation procedures, okay? So what we're going to test are the following three things. So we're going to test that skepticism in the consensus treatment is smaller than skepticism in the unilateral treatment. We're going to test that skepticism about the leader about person A in the consensus treatment is smaller than skepticism in the leader treatment, where A is the leader. And also that skepticism about person B in the consensus treatment is larger than skepticism about person B in the leader treatment, where they are the no leader. Okay. So these three orderings, they imply every other ordering that is stated in that proposition. Okay. And so these are our main hypotheses. Of course, our theory also introduces predictions regarding how group members make disclosure recommendations, right? So the theory predicts that someone should use a threshold strategy where they're going to recommend no disclosure when they get realization below the belief of no disclosure, and they recommend disclosure otherwise. So, and these thresholds in the threshold strategy should also vary across the deliberation procedures in the same way. So there's orderings in those thresholds as well. So each of these three hypotheses that I introduced here about the skepticism, they have parallels in terms of predictions about these individuals' disclosure recommendation behavior, right? So you should think about those as being like our hypothesis 4 through 6, yeah? Okay, so now that I've told you what the hypotheses are without introducing the experiment, I will introduce the experiment. So here's what we do in the lab. So in the lab, we create units of 3 subjects, okay? So we're going to have two people who play group member roles, group member A and group member B, and one person who plays the evaluator role, yeah? So in each round, each of these units of 3 people are going to play a group disclosure game very similar to what I described in the theoretical set, okay? And I'll walk you through these stages in a second. So these participants are going to play 30 rounds of the whole group disclosure game. And after each round, they are rematched but they always maintain the same role. So if you entered and you played the first round as group member A, you're forever going to play the role of group member A. Yeah. Okay. So let me walk you through the stages of this game that they play in the lab. So first, there's this card drawing stage. So each group member is going to draw a card from a deck of cards with a value between 0 and 10. Okay, these are uniformly drawn. And the pair of cards for person A and for person B are going to be denoted the group hand. Okay, so from the perspective of person A, what they're going to see is this image. So they're going to see that there was a card for person B, but I don't know the value. And also they're going to see the value of their own card. Of course, for person B, it's going to be the other way around. They're going to see their own value. Then there's going to be a reporting stage at which both people are going to submit their reporting recommendations. So person A, each of these people, here's from the perspective of person A again. So each of them is going to click a button saying whether they think we should disclose the group hand or whether we should not disclose the group hand. Okay. Okay. Next, the reporting stage is going to be such that these recommendations that the group members made are going to be aggregated according to whatever the group's deliberation procedure was. And then the group hand is going to be shown or not shown to the evaluator according to whatever the group's decision was. Yeah. And the deliberation procedure is exactly what we're going to vary across treatments here, as you might have imagined. So we're going to have these 3 treatments, which are going to correspond to the 3 procedures that I talked to you about before. So the consensus procedure, the unilateral procedure, and the leader procedure. Okay. So each of these people, everyone knows what deliberation procedure is being used by the group. And every subject who participates in our experiment is only exposed to the same treatment in all 30 rounds. Okay, so if you came in on a day that was the consensus procedure, you only ever play the consensus procedure. Yeah. Okay, so after this, the evaluator is going to either see or not see the group hand according to what the group chose. And then they're going to have to guess what the value for person A was and what the value for person B was. Okay, so this, for example, if the group chose to disclose, this is what the evaluator is going to see. They're going to see both of the cards, and then they're going to be prompted, hey, enter here your guess A of group member A's value, and enter here your guess, B of group member B's value. Okay, so they should include both of those values there. Of course, if the cards were shown, unless the evaluator is silly in some way, they should just copy these 2 numbers, right? So here 8 and there 9. So the alternative is that the group does not show the group hand, in which case this is what the observer is going to see. Okay, they're not going to see the values of the cards. They're going to again be prompted to guess each of these values. And here we're going to remind them of what the procedure was. Okay, so here's this screen is for the consensus treatment. So we're going to say the group hand was not reported. What this means is that group member A, group member B, or both group members recommended not to report. Okay, so we're reminding the observer of what the procedure is that the group used. Okay, so then there's a feedback stage at which the participants are shown a screen containing a bunch of information. So containing what the group hand was, whether it was reported or not, and the pair of evaluated guesses that were made in that current round. Okay, so this is how these participants are going to be rewarded. So first, the evaluator is going to be rewarded for accuracy of their guesses, and I'll come back to this in a second. And the group members are going to be rewarded for the evaluator guessing a high number. Okay, so if I'm person A, I want the evaluator to guess a high number for value A. Okay, so in terms of how the evaluator is rewarded for accuracy, Ala, you interrupt me if I'm misspeaking, but I understand that it is a very contentious subject in the experimental literature of how you should reward people for accuracy, okay? So I really don't have much to say other than we followed what has been done in previous papers some of the previous papers that are looking at individual disclosure. And so we're looking at using 1.4 as this exponent here. I really think that this is not really at all a settled question on what's the best way to do this, but this is what we did in this case, yeah? Okay. So another thing that we do in the experiment, other than these people playing the 30 rounds that they played, is that at the end of play, we also ask the subjects to answer an incentivized questionnaire, okay? So we ask them to answer the following questions. So first we say, suppose you are an evaluator and that the group hand was not reported to you by the group. What would your guess be of person A's value? And what would your guess be of person B's value? Okay. So we ask this question because we want everyone who played any role to answer to us what they would, like what their guesses would have been, okay? So we know the guesses for the people who played the evaluator role throughout the game, but we also here, we get some guesses from the people who played the group member roles, okay? And this is going to come in handy later on in the results. And then we also ask like how they would have played if they were the group members. So suppose you are group member A and the group hand is drawn in which this is your value. What would you recommend? So as I said, again, this questionnaire happens after everything else, and it's also incentivized. Okay, I'll tell you some results. Oh no, this experiment was conducted at Indiana University. So we had 4 sessions for each treatment. So as I said, we had 3 treatments that were according to the different deliberation procedures, okay? These are what we call the group treatments. And I should also add that we do have an extra treatment, which we call the individual treatment, in which instead of having 2 people playing the group disclosure game that I described, we have a parallel disclosure game in which there's only one individual who sees just one card and is making disclosure recommendations that they have full power over, okay? So such individual disclosure games have been played in the lab before. We just wanted to do it in our exact setup so that we can compare results to what we get in the group setting, okay? So most of our sessions had 5 units playing, and in total there were 224 subjects, and they earned an average of $20. Okay, now results. Okay, so I told you that our main hypotheses are about the skepticism across the different treatments, okay? So these are the values of skepticism that we found. So these are reporting the average across all rounds of play here, okay? So rather than point at numbers here, let me just show you a summary of hypotheses that we tested. So these hypotheses correspond exactly to the 3 hypotheses that I stated to you before, which are comparing the ordering of skepticism across these different treatments. So for example, remember that we predicted that there was more skepticism in the unilateral treatment than in the consensus treatment, right? And this is exactly what we find in the lab. Also, we predicted more skepticism in the leader treatment about the leader than in the consensus, which also holds, and the opposite, less skepticism about the person who is the non-leader than what they would have in the consensus treatment, and that also holds, okay? So just to comment, I have a button here that I could click on. So we can also test the same hypothesis. Instead of using the gameplay data, we could also use the data that we got from the questionnaire. And in that case, we could test like for the people who played the evaluator role, but also for the people who played the group member roles, and the same hypothesis they hold in all those cases. Ala, you remind me if I'm wrong, but I think we also tested by dropping like the first 10 observations, and also the same hypothesis hold in that case, okay? So this is reassuring that what our theory predicted there holds in terms of our main 3 hypotheses. Now, let me tell you 2 other things that also come. So these are other hypotheses also testing the values that are coming from this table again, okay? So 2 other tests that we do are that we try to compare what is the skepticism that we find in the individual treatment versus what we find in the leader treatment, okay? And what is the skepticism that we find in the individual treatment versus what we find in the unilateral treatment. So here, we're not just comparing across the group treatments, but rather we're comparing the group treatments to the treatment where there was only one individual making decisions, okay? So theoretically, the prediction would be that in all these circumstances, we would have full unraveling, okay? So what the theoretical prediction is that skepticism should be full about in all these 3 circumstances, okay? But you can see that that's not what we find, okay? So first, we don't find full skepticism. And 2, we don't find that necessarily these numbers are equal across the 3 treatments, okay? So let me comment on this in parts. So first, the skepticism in the individual treatment doesn't significantly differ from skepticism in the leader treatment, and full unraveling doesn't arise in either of these treatments, okay? So this is in line with the absence of full unraveling in previous individual disclosure experiments, as I mentioned to you already. But it's a bit in contrast with like a literature that exists in like a managerial psychology, which proposes this idea of the romance of leadership. So the romance of leadership is something that says that too much responsibility for group outcomes tends to be assigned to the person who is the leader, even when they're not to blame for for whatever happens to a group. Okay, so here, what we find instead is that we don't have too much blame being attributed to the leader, okay? Not relative to what's predicted by the theory, which would predict that there's more blame, so more skepticism about the leader, and also not relative to the individual treatment, okay? So we're finding that here, this leader is basically just, held accountable exactly as you would expect if it wasn't the individual treatment, which is what the theory predicts. About the second test, so we find that skepticism in the individual treatment differs from that in the unilateral treatment. As already commented, the theory predicts that these two numbers should not be different because full blame for no disclosure is due for each of the group members in the unilateral treatment, okay? And in contrast, what we find is that there's a bit of like an erosion of individual blame when these people are in a group, okay? Yes.
And Paula, sorry.
Yes.
Is this also true? Oh, sorry. No, I was just asking, is it also true if you just look at the last 20 rounds, for instance? Like, does this difference between individual and collective blame?
I know that these ones are true. I don't remember if we tested these ones. So Ala, you can write this down. I forget. I feel like we've run so many tests that I forget all of them. But I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Did you get the 10-minute warning? Okay.
Oh, yeah, I got it now. Sounds good.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is what I'm saying. Individual blame is eroded in this unilateral treatment relative to the individual treatment. Okay, now, as I said, so everything I told you about so far is in terms of testing what is the skepticism that we see in the lab in these various treatments that we did. Now, let me comment a little bit on what we find regarding how individuals make their reporting recommendations. Okay, so whether they suggest disclosure or not disclosure. So let me remind you that our theory predicts that people should make recommendations that they should suggest not to disclose when they get their personal values are low, and they should recommend disclosure when their personal values are high, right? And there should be a threshold at which they switch from no disclosure to disclosure. So this threshold should be different across the different deliberation procedures as predicted by the theory. So what we find here is a little bit of differences in recommendations and how these people make recommendations, disclosure recommendations across the different treatments. So for example, here, one of our predictions is that people should recommend disclosure more often in the leader treatment than in the consensus treatment. Maybe this is sort of something that we find, but it's not really so persuasive, right? And also, if we're comparing the consensus treatment to the unilateral, we should also be seeing that there's more disclosure recommendation in the unilateral treatment than in the consensus treatment. And it's really, again, we don't find so much here, we don't find any significant differences across these two treatments, okay? So this is one part of what we found in the lab that really doesn't square very much with the theory. So this is one way to see it. We can also see it in another way, which is, as I said, these people should be playing threshold recommendation strategies. So we can also try to see whether they are doing that and what are the thresholds that they're using. So let me say how we do that. So first, we try to assess whether people are using threshold recommendation strategies. So we can see for each person who played a group member role, what are all the values for which they recommended no disclosure? What are all the values for which they recommended disclosure? If these two sets overlap by less than 2, okay? Like, so if there's less than 2 instances in which the no disclosure and the disclosure sets for a certain person overlap, then we say that that person is playing a threshold strategy, okay? And we find that across various treatments, these people tend to play a threshold strategy a lot, okay? And whenever someone does play a threshold strategy, we try to see what is their recommendation threshold that they were using, okay? And the way that we define these recommendation thresholds is, again, we have these two sets, the ones that recommended no disclosure, the ones that recommended disclosure. So we say that their threshold is the largest number for which they recommended no disclosure, and they did not recommend disclosure, okay? So that's what we're going to say is someone's threshold. Okay, so the same thing that I was trying to say here, I can also say by plotting the CDF of the thresholds across the people who played threshold strategies in the lab, okay? So here I'm showing you, for example, that in the leader treatment, the leaders tend to use lower thresholds than in the consensus treatment, which is what our theory predicts. But when we're looking at the consensus and unilateral, doesn't seem like there's a very clear pattern here either, okay? So, okay. So there's two things that I think that I said to you so far, which are sort of the main contrasts between the theoretical predictions and the experimental results, okay? So on the one hand, I showed you that there's low skepticism in the unilateral treatment relative to what we see in the individual treatment. And also that there's no consistent differences in the reporting strategies between unilateral and consensus treatments, yeah? So I wanted to argue that at least to some extent, we can make sense of these discrepancies by thinking about that these people might have social preferences, okay? So let me tell you what I mean by social preferences here. So I'm gonna say someone is altruistic or has altruistic preferences if whenever they're calculating whatever their mental payoff, they place some weight on their own direct payoff from the baseline game, but also they place some non-zero weight on whatever their partner's value is in that game, okay? So this alpha here is a positive number, right? So I'm not going to show you these theoretical results, but we have theoretical results in the paper that are saying three things about what happens to altruistic individuals in this game, okay? Let me just read them through and then I'll explain. So first, we show that an equilibrium without full disclosure might actually exist under the unilateral procedure when people have altruistic preferences. Second, we show that under the unilateral procedure, altruistic individuals use reporting thresholds that are larger than this belief of no disclosure, okay? And under the consensus treatment, under the consensus procedure, altruistic individuals use reporting thresholds that are smaller than this belief of no disclosure. Okay, let me try to argue a little bit informally to you what happens here. So you might remember that in our lab and also in our theory, person A, for example, they don't see person B's value, right? That was drawn. So when I'm like altruistic, it's not that I'm seeing Agata's value and I'm making a decision that is like that directly cares about her value. But I know that depending on what recommendation I make, I might give Agata some option value, okay? Let me explain. So suppose we're playing the unilateral procedure in which both of us have the power to unilaterally enforce disclosure. In that case, if I'm person A, I know that if I recommend no disclosure, then basically I'm giving Agata the power to choose whether she wants to disclose or not to disclose, okay? So, because then her decision is fully pivotal, right? So in that case, if I'm playing the unilateral procedure, what that means is that if I'm, so in terms of my own value, I'm pretty much indifferent between disclosing or not disclosing. So I'm very close, what value I drew is very close to this value. Then maybe I would rather recommend no disclosure in order to give Agata the option value of making the decision that she wants, okay? And in order to give Agata that value, what I have to do is I have to recommend no disclosure. So what that means is that I'm going to recommend no disclosure even when that doesn't make sense necessarily in terms of my own value. So I'm going to use a reporting threshold that is going to be larger than this belief of no disclosure, right? And the opposite happens in the consensus procedure, in which case, if I want to give Agata option value, what I should do is I should recommend disclosure, in which case then she can enforce whatever belief whatever she wants, okay? Okay, so this first result that I told you here, that an equilibrium without full disclosure exists under the unilateral procedure if people are altruistic, I think that's one way in which I can sort of rationalize the fact that we see less unraveling here than what we see in the individual treatment, okay? So maybe this is one reasoning for that. Now, the other two results, the other two theoretical results that I have here are something that we can actually take to our data and test whether it happened in our lab, okay? So that's something that we do. And the way that we do this, remember that we had the questionnaire that we used to elicit what are the estimates of the people who played the group member roles of what these beliefs of no disclosure were, right? So like, remember that they answered a question saying, what would you have guessed if you were the person, the evaluator, and there was no disclosure. So we use those estimates as being the elicited beliefs of the people who played the group member roles. So what we can do is we can sort of test whether the people who played threshold strategies, whether the thresholds that they used are smaller or bigger or equal to the beliefs of no disclosure that we elicited in the questionnaire, okay? And what we find, let me highlight this to you, is that the modal subject in the consensus treatment uses a threshold that is smaller than their elicited belief. In the unilateral treatment, the modal person uses a threshold that is larger than their elicited belief. And in the individual treatment, these people, the modal person uses a threshold that is equal to their elicited belief, okay? So this very much, we see this as evidence, like indirect evidence at least, that maybe these people are playing, the people who are playing have these altruistic preferences, okay? And that maybe this first explanation here is not a bad explanation for why we have these differences in the unilateral procedure and individual. Also, because these people, if we're looking at these CDFs of the thresholds across the consensus and the unilateral treatment, that would also explain why they don't differ too much, because these thresholds are not really representing exactly what the beliefs of no disclosure are. Okay, so if we did take that into account, then they would become further apart. Okay, that's all I wanted to say here. So let me conclude. So this paper studied group communication. We brought together we brought a simple environment of disclosure by a group to an experimental setting, okay? Our main results establish a dual role of an organization's power structure in communication. So it both determines how a group speaks, because it tells me how these recommendations get aggregated into decisions for the group, but also how the group gets understood, okay? I want to remark again that we believe that the most novel thing here in terms of theory and also in terms of the empirics is this part of like that we show that the power structure affects how a group is understood. And we believe that that new mechanism should also hold for other various kinds of communication protocols, and that we see this as just an illustration of what happens in a group setting to the most simplest communication protocol that we could think of. We have a technical contribution to the experimental literature in that we study a Bayesian game played by a group, and we introduce this notion of targeted skepticism as a measure of the attribution of blame to individuals in a collective decision. We have some things that we're planning to do next, but I'll just stop here because I'm over time. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So I want to give the panelists an opportunity for any final questions or comments. Agata, do you want to start?
Yes, I actually have just a couple of questions. First, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading the paper, so that was great. And I think it's good that all the comparative studies are satisfied, because at least it suggests that even if the receivers are not skeptical enough, they do understand what are the main forces behind the disclosure. So I think that was great. I found the results on the romance of leadership that you mentioned at some point very interesting. The fact that leaders don't get attributed like more blame than what it actually is. But I wonder whether it would be possible to do a similar test with a smaller epsilon. With a larger epsilon. Epsilon was the probability of the follower, because in this particular setting, as you design, basically all the power is on the leader, and you get that you get the same skepticism as in the unilateral treatment, which we could think about as the right benchmark, because there are all the other failures that we know go on. So that, let's say that's the right benchmark. So it seems like they are attributing the full blame to the leader, but there is no possibility to attribute more than that, because that's already full. Well, if instead we have something in which the leader could have, I don't know, 80% probability of disclosing, then there maybe we could see if there is also this result that there is not overly attribution of blame. Right. So that's something that I think it could be interesting.
I agree with you.
right?
So I guess in terms of the theory, I actually hadn't thought of this, but it's interesting that you're saying this. Yeah, correct. Like we don't allow even the possibility of like what is more attribution, right? Like to the leader.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, in the experiment, because we see such small numbers of like skepticism, like right, we don't see anything close to one, then actually that could have arisen in the experiment. But that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about.
For sure, but I don't know if that could be due to other stuff. Like I don't know, people are not able to account for the selection of the evidence, this kind of things. Well, if instead you find the same result even with a smaller power for the leader, I think that would be like that would suggest it's like very robust. And then the other thing that I wanted to ask is whether you have thought about doing any kind of heterogeneity analysis for sender and receiver, like trying to cluster what they do, because from the table you showed at the end with the standard threshold, there is some variation in how they behave. And so maybe there could be something interesting in looking at like what they do individually. And I don't know if there is also something like that in the receiver data.
I think when we saw that there was no difference between like these thresholds, like across the different treatments. So I think we did a little bit like of exploring into like, oh, are there just some silly people who like just don't know how to play? Like, should we be like removing some people? Are there people who just love disclosing? Are there people who hate disclosing and so on? And there was a little bit of that, right, Ala? And we tried a little bit like to remove those and to not remove those. But we didn't do anything very systematically, if I remember. And we definitely, I don't remember any numbers of like, oh, there's these many people who like disclosing or this. So yeah, maybe we should put in more effort into looking into this. But we did do a little bit of like some exploration.
Yeah, maybe there is nothing there, but the fact that you are looking at this threshold and there is like variation on the sign that maybe suggests there is something. And then very, very last thing, I think it would also be interesting to run, I don't know if you're planning that, but to run some treatments in which the sender sees the number of the other sender, because that would in some sense give more live evidence of the fact that there are social preferences and that is like the right explanation for the data. But that's all I
think in the end here I had some comments on like future things that we're trying to do. Okay. And whatever, I'm not going to comment on them right now, but one of the things that like four other questions that we want to answer, I think we would be very important for us to be able to put a number to the social preferences. And the reason that the way that we're thinking to do this is exactly as you say, to directly let them see each other's values. So we're definitely planning to do that. We weren't thinking about doing that for this paper, but we might just as well. We were planning to use that for something else, but yes, we were definitely thinking to run that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Eduardo, do you have any last comments or questions?
Yes, so thank you, Paula. It was a very interesting paper. I mean, I like the general framework very much. I think that there are potentially a lot of things to do with that idea of playing with, group interactions and disclosure at the same time. So for the experiment, I was actually surprised that it didn't work a bit better for the disclosure part.
You mean the strategies?
Yeah, the strategies. So it does work well for the skepticism. It could have not been the case. It could have been the case that, I mean, we know that there is insufficient skepticism in the models when there is unraveling, and it could have been that this insufficient skepticism only kicks there, and that could have even destroyed your predictions, but it doesn't. So it looks like there's insufficient skepticism in all cases, which is interesting to know by itself. So I guess I had some comments on data that you ended up not showing, so I'm not going to make them. Maybe I can tell you later. So here's another point on the altruism is I guess you made the point in the beginning that the theory would apply equally well, if the group members knew each other as omega I. And so, but see, if your real explanation of the data in the experiment is actually these altruistic preferences, I imagine that if that's if that's their real preferences, then revealing the omega I's of the others would make a difference. And that could be a way to potentially test this theory in the lab to see whether you see such changes.
Yeah, so I think what I showed you here is a bit of like a indirect test, right? But I think we could like test it directly by doing, I guess, these two things. But I think I don't know how much people tend to reveal how the sausage is made, but like the way that this happened for us was that like when we started thinking of the experiment, we were very concerned that there might be altruism, you know, or social preferences, and that like we had to like shut down any possibility that happens in the lab. And so we were like, oh, let's not let these people see each other's values, and like maybe that's going to resolve this like potential issue. And then ex post, I realized, like once we were like digging into the data, then I realized, oh, actually, even we weren't able to shut this down, right? Because there's this whole other like strategic channel and so on and so forth. So and then I think it was I was actually quite happy to see how we have this indirect evidence, at least, you know. I thought it's very cute that this actually to some extent is happening in the lab. So maybe this explanation does play a role. But I think this was very much not how we were thinking this was going to go.
All right. Yeah, we still have a little bit of time in case someone else wants to ask a question. If there are no burning questions, then we can stop the recording and the official part. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you next week, hopefully. Thanks to Paula, Ala, and Eduardo and Agata for being here and helping us out. And